Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about Aristotle, walking a little off the path from Stoicism, and going to be discussing a different account, one of those classic different accounts of virtue, the good life, happiness, and so on.
Yeah, I wanted to do this episode. So the point of this episode, looking at Aristotle's ethics at a high level, so his view on how to live or how to be a good person. Specifically want to focus on this idea of virtue as the golden mean, or virtue as a mean between two extremes. That might be new to some people. That might be a very familiar concept to others. So what does that mean? What is Aristotle's account of how to live well and what virtue looks like? And also contrasted at the end with what the Stoics think. So both to understand Aristotle better for our own benefit, and then also to improve our understanding of Stoicism by providing this kind of foil. I really do think one of the best ways to understand what the Stoics are saying is to understand what other schools have said or what people that disagree with them say. And it really draws out the both theoretical and practical implications of the Stoics better. When Aristotle disagrees, you really have to make sure you understand what the Stoics are arguing and then decide based on that criteria whether or not you agree with them. So that's what we'll be doing today. I think Aristotle's this funny one because I found him a bit dry. I think everybody who reads Aristotle finds him a bit dry at first, or certainly when you read him next to the Stoics. He was famously the student of Plato, and depending on who you talk to, possibly the greatest philosopher of all time. I know in the medieval ages he was referred to as the philosopher because he was just kind of the most profound thinker, or kind of seen as the pinnacle of the ancient Greek tradition or Roman tradition. It's really like that was Aristotle was the guy to a lot of people. I think that's maybe a bit more contested now. I think there's maybe a bit of a Plato resurgence, but I know Aristotle is one of those ancient Greek philosophers also that's still treated pretty seriously by contemporary philosophy. Like, it's not unusual to see contemporary philosophers citing or referring to Aristotle, whether that's in metaphysics, ethics, even political philosophy, even if it's just kind of situated as like, the thinking started here with Aristotle and then it bounced around and we got to this end point. So, somebody really taken seriously in philosophy. Another thing about Aristotle's approach to thinking is he was kind of inductive. And so there's this almost like bottom up or like observational approach. And I find when you read Aristotle, he'll start a lot of things. The Stoics make this appeal, something we talk about a lot, Caleb. They make this appeal to nature, and they say, well, to figure out the purpose of life, you've got to look at the nature of a human. And there's this kind of appeal to the natural world in all of ancient philosophy. But Aristotle is almost a bit more like common sense. It's this appeal like, well, the average person thinks this. Or, if you walked around the marketplace, people would talk about virtue like this. And he almost uses that as a reference point. It's kind of interesting because he was also known for a lot of advances in biology as well. Like went out and observed a lot of animals, recorded different species, their kind of breeding patterns, how they give birth, their biology. And so he had this real, I guess, reverence. I'm trying to argue, had this reverence for this observation of the world, and not just this appeal to nature and this big N kind of stoic conception of the universe, but also if I want to know how to live, I'm going to go out into the marketplace. I'm going to talk to people, and maybe they're confused, maybe they're right or wrong, but there's at least something to be gained from almost this deductive, qualitative observation approach. That's something I like about Aristotle. And so anything else you want to say by way of background before we jump into his thinking?
Well, I'd certainly buttress that by saying Aristotle is maybe one way to capture what you're saying is that he's an observational philosopher, and he'll say, just as we can look around the world and see and this is something we'll talk about in this podcast a lot, the importance of excess and deficiency in health. And then he'll talk about some basic observation about health and then tie that in with ethics. So I think that's one way you see this sort of observational method playing out in his thinking. And it is connected to biology. He shares the same assumption with the Stoics about appealing to nature, I would say, but perhaps the Stoics really honed in on the rational side of nature, the rational side of ourselves, but perhaps Aristotle didn't hone in as much on a specific attribute, but instead is piecing together a number of different observations he's made about specific organisms, about humans and such. So in that way, it's perhaps more detailed, and I think that's one of the perhaps the joys and frustrations of reading Aristotle. So he's sort of that he is so detailed. He's a taxonomist of sorts, drawing distinctions, making different observations, and that can be very fruitful and sometimes difficult to go through as well.
Yeah. And another thing that's fun about Aristotle, I guess two other things I wanted to add in support. So he's got this observational style, and then I think just like funny facts, he's kind of notorious for getting some of these things wrong. Too, like he famously claimed that women have less teeth than men, and humans, and so there's this almost this funny, like there's so much, um, I don't know. It's just funny when you see something like that, because it's like such a smart person, such this kind of methodical approach, but still these mistakes come in. And I think that's something to keep an eye out for when you're, then getting to these questions of like how to live and how to be. And another thing about Aristotle, I made a comment about him being really boring at the start or dry, but we've actually lost a lot of his books, and he had ones for popular audiences and then ones which were more, um, lecture notes for his students at the Lyceum. And that's what we have left over. At least the Nicomachean Ethics, which we're going to get into, is one of those. And so he's a lot more dry, or can be more, I would say, academic than Seneca or Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius. And part of that is probably just his style and disposition, but another part is that we've lost his writings that were for more of a popular audience, and we have really his lecture notes for his students. Certainly the Nicomachean Ethics that we'll be talking about falls in that category. And so you can think of like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca reading and reflecting on the more academic of the Stoics, Chrysippus and Zeno, but we don't really have their writings in as great of detail. Where in Aristotle, we still have those kind of original foundational texts where he really systematically lays everything out. And that speaks to his style.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose one other thing I should have said, there's no way, if you're making any list of the greatest philosophers of ancient Greece, there's no way Aristotle's not in the top three. I think most people probably put him in top two, but if you're a Stoic, you know about Chrysippus, so maybe you toss Chrysippus in the top three as well. But I mean, he's certainly one of the greats.
Yeah, definitely. So cool. So we'll jump into it. So this is again Aristotle on the golden mean. What does that mean? What does the mean mean? And how does it contrast with the Stoic view on virtue? So we're going to be talking about Nicomachean Ethics. This is named after Aristotle's son, Nicomachus, and it's his most famous work on ethics. It's considered the most up-to-date one. So it's like possibly like the final stage of his thinking. And some key claims, we're going to be focusing a lot on books 1 and 2, mostly on book 2, where he actually makes this claim for virtue as a kind of mean. And some key parts that we get in book 1, leading into book 2, that lets us get into virtue, or the nature of virtue. So in book 1, Aristotle establishes eudaimonistic ethics. And this is this view, I mean, we talk about this all the time, Caleb, was this idea comes from Aristotle, or at least it's systematically laid out in Aristotle, which is that everything we do has an ends or a goal. If you ask why long enough, you get back to the final goal that all things have, which is happiness. So, why do I wake up in the morning to go to work? Why do I go to work? Well, to, do well in my job. Why do I want to do well in my job? Well, either because I find it meaningful or because I want money. Why do you want meaning or money? Well, because they make me happy. And every line of questioning ends up with that final response. We think, well, that's what is a good life. Like I don't have, there's no way to justify wanting a good life. That is just the bedrock of, what you can want. And then, so then Aristotle sets out in the book to say, well, okay, if the goal of life then is happiness, that is the telos or the ends for humans, what is the content of that? What does that look like? What does it involve? And he ends up arguing that it's got to involve human excellence. It's got to involve virtue. So you can't be happy or have a great life unless you are being a great human. That's one of his arguments. Another thing is that so that's one part. Another thing he talks about in book 1, which differentiates himself from the Stoics immediately, and this is pre-Stoicism, so he wasn't differentiating himself, but he just disagrees, is that the soul is divided into 3 parts. So when you say becoming an excellent human, what is a human? Well, at the very least, it is our soul, and our soul has 3 parts. It's got a vegetative part that's shared with all living things, but it's not responsive to reason. You can't communicate with it. You've got a appetitive part. So that's what desires things. That's the part of you that maybe, gets hungry, jumps away from pain, maybe gets in a really bad mood if you haven't been sleeping enough and wants to just drop everything, go to sleep. That's me, at least. So it desires things. It's kind of connected with the body, but it can listen to reason. So you can be like, look, you're driving a car. Don't fall asleep now, even though you're really sleepy. Just stop. Just stay a little bit longer and you get a good sleep. Or you're driving. Don't eat at this gas station, even though you're really hungry. If you keep driving a little bit longer, there'll be an even tastier meal. So you can kind of communicate with the appetitive part of yourself. It can collaborate with reason. The vegetative part of yourself, I should have said, that's something probably, the part of you that makes your bones grow or something, or the part of you that like communicates with your, makes your muscles respond to weightlifting or something. It's not the kind of thing you engage with reason. And then the third part is the rational part of yourself. That's the part that is has reason, is rational, and can order and command the appetitive part. So since we have these 3 parts of the soul, virtues then are of 2 kinds, Aristotle argues. First, there is the intellectual virtues, which correspond to the rational part of the soul. These are things you learn through instruction and knowledge. And then there are moral virtues. These correspond to the irrational, appetitive part of the soul. And these are things that you have to learn through habituation and practice. So that, I think, is the first division. The Stoics think of the soul as being unified. You're just a rational thing. And Aristotle thinks, no, you've kind of got these multiple parts of you, and then they become excellent in different ways. The rational part of you becomes excellent through learning. The appetitive part of yourself becomes excellent through habituation and training. The same way you would think of, an animal would have an appetitive part of yourself. How do you make an excellent dog? It's not by sitting down and talking to the dog. It's by training the dog, punishing them when they do something wrong, rewarding them when they do something right, and then you end up with an excellent pet. And you think of the same kind of thing for yourself or for people. You can teach them intellectual virtues, but you need to train them in moral virtues. One last part, and then see if you have any thoughts, Caleb, is that virtues are not natural, is another thing he clarifies. We're not born with virtue. Otherwise, we wouldn't require intervention to develop. Virtues are like a skill or a craft. This is actually an interesting response to the Stoics, because the Stoics say virtue is knowledge, it's living in accordance with reason, and then the Stoics have to respond, well, if virtue is living in accordance with reason, if being a good person is living in accordance with reason, why is everybody such terrible people? And the Stoics have to say, well, you kind of get corrupted, things happen. Aristotle makes a different analogy. He says, no, virtue is like a craft. It's like a skill. You're not born knowing how to shoot a bow and arrow. You're not born knowing how to paint. You have to develop this excellence. They're either developed or destroyed based on how we act. And I have some quotes here. This is from Book 2, Part 1. Aristotle says, "The virtues, on the other hand, we acquire by first having actually practiced them, just as we do the arts. We learn an art or craft by doing the things that we shall have to do when we have learnt it. For instance, men become builders by building houses, harpers by playing the harp. Similarly, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts." And again, even a later part, he says, "Again, the actions from or through which any virtue is produced are the same as those through which it is destroyed, just as is the case with skill in arts. For both the good harpers and the bad ones are produced by harping. Similarly with builders and all other craftsmen. As you will become a good builder from building well, so you will become a bad one from building badly." And this is another consequence of the skill view is, if you think of that in sport, there's this almost this sense that it's better to take somebody who's never played tennis than somebody who's played bad tennis and developed all these bad habits. And he's saying, so, if you never encounter anything scary, you just start at this exact neutral place. But if you encounter scary things and you act fearfully, you don't display courage, you're actually, the craft is really encountering scary things. If it's temperance, it's
Mhm.
encountering things you desire, and then you're either made stronger or weakened by those instances. But you're not anything until you're doing the thing that builds it. You are only innate potential until you've built a house or tried to build a house. Likewise for the virtues, it's a little bit different because I guess people go around not playing instruments all the time, but people don't really go around their day to day not encountering situations that require bravery or temperance.
Sure.
His point is makes sense, but I mean practically there's a bit of a difference. But it's just that you only build or weaken them by doing the corresponding thing, either well or poorly. So that's the setup. I think we need to get to the to talk about the golden mean. But anything you wanted to add to that?
I think that was really well summarized. So I suppose just to put in my own words, we have this question, this sort of philosophical question about, what is the purpose of life? What does it mean to live a good life? And Aristotle is proposing happiness is the telos of human life, and in particular, eudaimonia. It doesn't mean happiness. As we always clarify, it doesn't exactly just mean happiness in terms of a blissful state and such. It's something, a deeper state. What is, as you say, being an excellent human being, and it's not just an outcome, but it's better thought of as an activity. Being an excellent human being,
Yeah.
doing what excellent human beings do, and I'd say that's another important clarification Aristotle makes, and is sometimes at odds with how we think about happiness when we purely think of it as a binary state. You're either in or not. If you think I'm happy now, I'm not happy now. For Aristotle, that means in order for you to be happy, you need to be doing the sorts of things that a happy human would be doing. So I think that's an interesting framing when you think about the concept of happiness in your own life. But yeah, that's well summarized. So I suppose we've got that purpose, some picture of human nature. Unlike the Stoics, as you say, it involves these uh, aspects of the organism that have to do with the body, the vegetative, the appetitive parts of the soul. And then also another distinction between the Stoics that comes out of that is this difference in the kinds of virtues. You have the intellectual and the moral virtue, and also that practical point on what does it take to be moral. Well, it's requires habituation, and I think that's such a uh, in a sense, like just a common sense observation, but really is quite deep and useful if you're thinking about building skills in your own life and thinking about virtues, moral virtues as habits.
Yeah. I do think a lot about Aristotle's ideas around habituation. I find that really helpful in my own practice. So now we're in a position to talk about what does the golden mean? What's going on here? So Aristotle, he's established that, you've got these intellectual and moral virtues. You build them by doing things that correspond to them, like any other craft or skill. Nobody's getting better at archery while painting. Maybe there's the kind of, there's the Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. Maybe that person's getting better at karate, but at the end of the day, you got to do karate to get better at karate. You got to do brave, courageous things to become more courageous and brave. So, but Aristotle next moves to this question of, well, what actually is virtue? What does that mean? That seems like a vague question, but for the Stoics, they would say, well, virtue is knowledge, right? It's achieved by living in accordance with nature, which means understanding nature the way it is. But Aristotle has a different answer. He's going to say that virtue is a middle ground. It's a mean between excesses, just like any other desirable state. And I'll quote here from Book 2, Part 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says, first of all, then, we have to observe that moral qualities are so constituted as to be destroyed by excess and by deficiency, as we see is the case with bodily strength and health. For one is forced to explain what is invisible by means of visible illustrations. Aristotle's just saying, look, I'm just going to make an analogy here. Strength is destroyed both by excessive and deficient exercises, and similarly, health is destroyed both by too much and by too little food and drink, while they are produced, increased, and preserved by suitable quantities. The same, therefore, is true of temperance, courage, and other virtues. The man who runs away from everything in fear and never endures anything becomes a coward. The man who fears nothing whatsoever but encounters everything becomes rash. Similarly, he that indulges in every pleasure and refrains from none turns out to be profligate. Don't actually know that one. And he that shuns all pleasure, as boorish people do, becomes what may be called insensible. Thus, temperance and courage are destroyed by excess and deficiency and preserved by the observation of the mean. And so what Aristotle's saying here is, look, if you want to build muscle, you can't lift too much. You'll hurt yourself, and you can't lift too little. If you want to be a good body weight, you can't eat too much and you can't eat too little. When we talk about developing other kinds of excellence, we think about reaching the correct and appropriate quantity, the correct and appropriate amount. And so when we think about virtue, we should think about it in the same way. Courage is the right amount of fearfulness. It is running away when you should run away, and it's standing your ground when you should stand your ground. Another thing that he calls out is that how you feel when acting is important when we talk about virtue. So it's not just, I said, courage is running away when you should run away and standing when you should stand. But for Aristotle, that's not enough. He's actually going to say, well, you've got to actually feel the right way about it too. And he says, quote, an index of our dispositions is afforded by the pleasure or pain that accompanies our actions. A man is temperate if he abstains from bodily pleasure and finds this abstinence itself enjoyable, profligate if he feels it's irksome. He is brave if he faces danger with pleasure or at all events without pain, cowardly if he does so with pain. So in other words, you're not truly courageous by standing up to the army. You're courageous when you do it and you don't feel distress or in maybe even pleasure in some cases. So this is the first kind of hint we get from Aristotle reading this, that it's not just consequentialist kind of picture of what did you do. It's also how did it feel to do it when we're looking at genuine examples of virtue. Anything to add there before we go further?
Yeah, I think that matters. How it feels matters because that's how we become habituated. As this translation uses the word index, but I suppose you could also think of as measurement or perhaps information. It's easier to form habits that involve, the right amount of pleasure that makes it easy, easy to repeat in action.
Yeah, the point is not like you're a bad person. Aristotle's going to say pretty explicitly that better to be the person that stands up to the army with fear and feels distress than the person who runs away. You just don't point to that person and say, that's an example of courage. Sometimes we say in contemporary, sometimes we say today, everybody feels afraid. It's just how you respond to it. And Aristotle's going to say, no. The great people aren't afraid. but good for you for practicing. I think of this, you think of this like a instrument. It's like the really great musician is just naturally expressing themselves. And if you're sitting there and you're playing the same song, but it's very intentional, it's taking a lot of effort, you're finding it very uncomfortable, Aristotle's going to say, great, you're practicing. You're not a great musician yet. We don't point to you as an example. The great musicians can do that stuff naturally. They've habituated, as you've said, but you're practicing, you're getting closer. So it's not to knock that kind of behavior. You should still do the right things if it's difficult, but it's to say you haven't achieved the end goal yet if it's still difficult for you. The example I give too is like, if your friend asks you for a favor, or even in my own, I think about this in my own relationship. Sometimes my wife will ask for help with something, and sometimes I will do it graciously and quickly, and sometimes I'll be like, "Oh, I really don't want to. I really don't want to do that. I'm enjoying, relaxing or whatever I'm doing." And the action's the same, but you want to try to become the kind of person that helps, helps out of a genuine desire to do so. That is a better way to be. And Aristotle thinks you can get there by doing it enough.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. I suppose something else that comes out of this that I think is a useful point is the idea that negative feelings, negative emotions can be appropriate for some circumstances. For Aristotle, grief is appropriate when something tragic has happened, but even for perhaps smaller events, feeling nervous before a important performance as a musician, in some sense, is if it's too intense, it's not appropriate. But some amount of nervousness could be optimal. It signals the importance of the event, and if you are not nervous at all, perhaps there's be some risk of treating the performance in too flippant a manner. So I think that's another nice upshot is
Yeah.
negative feelings, emotions for in Aristotle. And for the Stoics as well, you think about the role of caution to some extent, or at least the role of negative feelings for the Stoics. But for Aristotle, I think he gives both pleasure and pain a purpose. I suppose is one way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, we'll get into that in more detail as we go, but I think the important point is that differentiation between what you do and then how you're feeling while you're doing it is very important for Aristotle. And it's important for the Stoics too. So, but as you said, how you're feeling can sometimes it's appropriate to feel a bit negative or even very negative, very upset. So you think about, he's not going to idealize the person who goes on for a performance and doesn't feel any nerves and is nonchalant. That person is probably a bit and doesn't have the correct reverence for the importance of a performance. He's going to look at that person who's the right amount of nervous and say, that's great. And then maybe if you can fake it till you make it and look like you're not nervous and go out and perform well, Aristotle's going to say, well, you were close to that right middle, but you still need to feel on the inside. It still matters what you feel on the inside. It doesn't matter if you could pass in front of the crowd or not. You
Right,
still
right.
got to get that just enough nervousness, but not too much. And so I'm going back to my notes here, going a bit over what we said, but it's worth repeating. As you read through book 2, Aristotle notes an issue where he says, if a person's doing something courageous, then how can they be learning anything? Because, if you go on stage and you play, how can you be practicing courage? Because clearly you're already courageous. You got on stage and you played. And Aristotle's saying, well, we're normally just doing courageous acts. We're not being courageous. He makes that distinction again between the inside and the outside. We're acting well in the moment, but we're not demonstrating virtue unless we have all the proper components, which is that internal disposition and then the actual action. I think of this like a BJJ competitor. We just use the example of performance versus a newbie versus an experienced competitor. So one person's imitating but building the skill at the same time, where the other person, it just comes naturally to them because they've practiced enough. And he says here, we demonstrate a virtue when we do something for the right reason. That's knowledge. It's, I think, the intellectual aspect. Deliberately. So that is this emotional aspect. We want to do it. We desire to do it. And then also from our disposition, he says it's not virtue if we do it in the spur of the moment. So sometimes I guess the idea is we can just kind of chance or luck into doing by accident the broken clock is right twice a day. You just did the objectively right thing, but it wasn't coming from your disposition. It's not how you normally act. It was kind of a, I guess if you think of like a musician playing the right note, unless you have that kind of understanding of why you're doing it, and it's kind of built into your skill. So there's a quote here from Aristotle. He says, "Moreover, the case of the arts is not really analogous to that of the virtues. Works of art have their merit in themselves, so that it's enough if they are produced having a certain quality of their own. But acts done in conformity with the virtues are not done justly or temperately if they themselves are of a certain sort, but only if the agent also is in a certain state of mind when he does them. First, he must act with knowledge. Second, he must deliberately choose the act and choose it for its own sake. And thirdly, the act must spring from a fixed and permanent disposition of character." So this is the part that I was speaking to before, but also he's clarifying, again, that consequentialist versus internal picture. Um, if you make a great work of art, it doesn't matter if you spilt and knocked over the can of paint and it made something cool by accident. There's still something cool in the world. Aristotle's like, no, there's no virtue even if you stumbled into doing the right thing. You've got to do it. You got to do it for the right reason. You got to have knowledge. You got to deliberately choose it because it's the right thing to do. You got to want to do it. And then it's got to spring from a fixed or permanent disposition of your character, not just a, and you can think of this, somebody who's just kind in the moment. It's not really, I guess it's not really kind of a robust kindness. It's not the same as the kind of person that has a disposition to be kind.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. There's a nice practical point that Aristotle makes around this section where he notes that we become temperate by abstaining from pleasures, and at the same time we are best able to abstain from pleasures when we have become temperate. And so with courage we become brave by training ourselves to despise and endure terrors, and we shall best be able to endure terrors when we have become brave.
Hmm.
That just that point that these skills are self-reinforcing in a way, by practicing abstaining from pleasures, it becomes easier to be temperate. And by being temperate, it becomes easier to practice and so on. So I think that's I
Yeah.
think that's just a nice observation.
Well, there's this kind of idea of, practice makes perfect. And then people will say in sport, well, no, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And it's this idea that it's better to drill slowly and correctly a couple times than drill poorly many times. And that's kind of that's what I think about when I hear that line, is that, the good basketball player shoots correctly, and you get better by the number of reps you've done with good technique. So the better your technique you are, the better it is to rep the good technique. And so it kind of compounds and builds on itself. And so it kind of requires the most effort at the beginning. It's the most difficult to build the skill at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I think there's also the idea that perhaps progress is non-linear, and as you get better at any skill, someone who is uh, in the advanced or expert parts of those skill, because they've made so much progress, they're able to combine their traits, or they're able to avoid making terrible decisions that would set them back. And because of that, they're just going to be levels above beginners, novices, and so on. So I think maybe there's that point here from the moral domain as well. As you become, say, take moderation as an example, as you become more moderate, you're able to abstain from pleasures that would set you back a little bit, and just repeatedly doing that can put you uh, to the extent that these sorts of things can be measured, that can put you eons ahead of maybe where you were a year ago or something like this, if you can continue that practice. So I
Yeah.
think there's something inspirational there, and there's also maybe there's also the message around risks there, that if you don't abstain from pleasures now, then you are setting yourself back, and in a way perhaps robbing yourself of that progress as well.
Well, I also, we've got more to go into, so I don't want to go on this for too long, but I mean, there's also a piece of empathy there, right? Like it's the people that are the worst off have it the hardest to get better. I think about this in terms of something like investing, right? Like when you have the least amount of money, there's probably the most upside to developing good habits around, financial literacy and skills. but it's actually the most difficult to do so because to save parts of your money is incredibly impactful. And so likewise, the intemperate person, the person who's struggling with drugs or alcohol or food, can most benefit from temperance, but has the hardest time doing it because they're the most habituated or disposed already, or in a cycle. So there is some empathy there too for people that struggle, and that's why you almost require, I would say, this kind of intense intervention or intense focus in these moments to try to get that cycle swinging the other direction. And Aristotle's just attuned to that, I think.
Absolutely. All right, let's get back on track.
Cool. So I wanted to talk about the golden mean a bit more. So we've already framed, okay, Aristotle thinks, okay, virtue is this middle between excess and deficiency. It's like, a good diet is not eating too much food, it's not eating too little. A good exercise routine is not lifting too much, lifting too little. What are the actual practical implications of this? What does this mean in more detail? Well, one, it's that virtue is not about absolutes. It's not about, for the Stoics, it's very much about absolutes. Anger is always wrong. It's not in Aristotle's picture. Sometimes it's a right to be angry. Sometimes it's right to be sad or grieve. Sometimes we feel pleasure. Sometimes we feel pain. It's about achieving the right balance in the moment relative to you. And so he says in book 2, part 6, for example, one can be frightened or bold, feel desire or anger or pity, and experience pleasure and pain in general, either too much or too little, and in both cases wrongly. Whereas to feel these things at the right time, on the right occasion, towards the right people, for the right purpose, and in the right manner, is to feel the best amount of them, which is the mean amount. And the best amount is, of course, the mark of virtue. So we find the mean, Aristotle says, by experiencing things at the right time, in the right place, towards the right people, for the right reason, and in the right way. So a lot of components there. But the takeaway there, as you were alluding to earlier, is that sometimes the right time and right place is to be angry. It's to lash out out of anger because someone's harmed you and they deserve punishment. Sometimes it is to grieve because a very bad thing has happened to you, and it is to feel the appropriate amount. The Stoics build, when the Stoics say things like anger or grief, they're going to call these passions. So they're already going to build this pejorative language into it where they're necessarily wrong. I'm not an expert on Aristotle's theory of emotions, but the important part here is that, look, there is an appropriate time for these things, whereas the Stoics are going to deal more in absolutes. No, we never feel anger because that's a passion. Passions are always wrong. So as Aristotle says in more detail, here's another great quote. Virtue then is a settled disposition of the mind, determining the choice of actions and emotions, consisting essentially in the observation of the mean relative to us, this being determined by principle, that is, as the prudent man would determine it. And it is a mean state between two vices, one of excess and one of defect. Furthermore, it is a mean state in that whereas the vices either fall short of or exceed what is right in feelings and in actions, virtue ascertains and adopts the mean. Hence, while in respect of its substance and the definition that states what it really is in essence, virtue is the observation of the mean, in point of excellence and rightness, it is an extreme. So I guess there's an interesting point there, which is that it is in one sense an extreme, but it's the extreme middle. It's the extreme rightness. And so he's just saying there's a bit of circularity there, at least in this quote, which is that, virtue is the disposition of the mind, determining the right thing to do and to feel relative to us and to like who we are and the situation that we're in, as the prudent person would determine it. So as the virtuous person would determine it. So there's a bit of, and I think that's a bit of a skillfulness, right? That's where we're lucky to have the craft analogy, right? The correct play is the play that the excellent soccer player would make if they had your body and were in your position, and the score of the game is the score that it is, where it's the note the excellent musician would play if they were listening to the song and playing along to the song you're playing along to. So there's this relative, it's relativistic because it matters who you are and the situation that you're in, but it's always going to be this balance between excess and deficiency. So some examples that he lays out: courage is the mean between fear and rashness. Temperance is the mean between being sensible and profligate. Liberality is liberality and sharing money is the mean between meanness and prodigality. So sharing too much. Honor is the mean between vanity and smallness of soul. I like that idea of smallness of soul is just like not respecting yourself, or not like thinking, underestimating how good you really are.
Yeah, it's a great
Um,
phrase.
in regards to anger, gentleness is the mean between irascibility and spiritlessness. Again, you get that spiritlessness. Um, where the Stoics would say anger is never right, Aristotle says, well, you don't want to be the person that anything will tick you off, but you also don't want to be this person that has no spirit, has nothing that you will stand up for. And righteous indignation is the mean between envy and malice. Um, so sometimes one extreme is worse than another. Um, I would say probably irascibility is worse than spiritlessness. But the mean is not always about landing exactly in the middle. It's about hitting the appropriate balance. And sometimes that appropriate balance is going to be, it's not literally like if one is a one, if it's 0 and 2, I've always got to hit 1. It's about sometimes the situation is going to demand more vanity, and sometimes it's going to demand more smallness of soul. Sometimes it's going to demand more fear. Sometimes it's going to demand more rashness. It's about hitting um, that right balance. Anything to add to that?
Maybe one quick aside that I should state is, um, I think there is some interpretive debate about how to properly understand the doctrine of the mean. Is it, to what extent does Aristotle think all virtues fall on make for a mean? Is this more of a heuristic, maybe a rule of thumb? He is clear that not all actions and emotions follow this rule. So there are some actions that are simply intrinsically wrong. He lists malice or shamelessness. There's no mean to find there. But however you answer this interpretive question, I think he gives us a number of examples: courage, temperance, liberality, honor, that prove this is a useful notion.
Yeah, I think we need to be really careful with language too. Because what I take Aristotle to be saying is that when we think about the right thing to do, it's best to think about everything as a spectrum, and you're trying to land in the right middle ground of that spectrum. And so, you have the bully and you have the kid that's bullied. And then the right middle ground is the person who can stand up for themselves, but doesn't go around bullying other people. Right. That's the right mix between overtly aggressive and overtly passive. And so when you say something like malice, you're not talking about a spectrum there. You're talking about the an end point that is just a bad one. So I think it's like, and we're mixing the Greek and the English. So I think it's just like, I think it's, I mean, I agree with you. If Aristotle says that makes sense, that there's going to be some things that, we just don't think of in terms of a spectrum. It just doesn't make sense to talk about them that way. Um, but it's just this idea of instead of a binary, we think about things on a spectrum. And then in that case, every spectrum is going to have no goes on either ends of it. Um, but the where we land on the spectrum is, relative to ourselves and our circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's very clear that he says emotions and specific emotions and actions do not fall within a mean, but virtue is not
Hmm.
an emotion or an action. It's
Oh, okay. That's
it,
the distinction. I got it now.
it's this dispositional thing that, as you say, dealing with continuums, complexity, and such. And I think that's where the mean comes in.
Okay, I got it. So like you think about some sort of terrible action, I can't, I can think of some, but like I can't think of some the most terrible thing you could imagine that you would never want to do. And it's like, yeah, there's never going to be a situation where that is what somebody with virtue does. But that's not really what we're talking about. When we're talking about, as you said, the disposition. that balance between being overly aggressive and overly passive that makes you the kind of person that stands up for yourself and stands up for people weaker than you, but doesn't go around starting fights. And there are some things that person would never do, but that disposition, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about that disposition. Yeah, that's a great distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So some things that this means in practice to finish us off. I just wanted to, that was a lot of theory. I wanted to bring it back some practical implications of this. What does the gold mean for us or mean for Aristotle? In plain words, first thing this means that virtue is multifaceted. So it involves knowledge and pleasure, which is habituated. So it involves knowing the right thing to do and feeling the right way about it. You've got to do the right thing for the right reason and feel good. So it doesn't have one dimension, it has multiple dimensions. It combines the moral and the intellectual in Aristotle's words. Second is that virtue is finding the right balance between extremes. It is that disposition, the correct disposition on a spectrum of dispositions. The third point is that the balance depends on you and the situation. I think this is where the art metaphor is most important. The skilled musician picks the right note. Skilled athlete knows when to sprint and when to hold back. The perfect painting can have nothing added or removed to it. So the virtuous person is the same way when deciding how much anger to feel, for example. They've developed a skill through habituated practice that lets them, land on the right note, so to speak. I put here, and maybe this is what we were clarifying, that no category of action is really off limits. That's another point, only context dependent. For Aristotle, there are times when we can feel really angry. There are times when we can feel afraid or grieve. We just need to find the right amount. Maybe the distinction I would make now, since what you said, Caleb, is category is kind of vague. Maybe there are some specific emotions and actions that are out of bounds. No, there will be no context where that is the right thing to fall on. But there is no, I guess, spectrum that you need to always remain on one end of. Like if you told the Stoics there was a spectrum of anger, the Stoics would say, well, you can't dip your foot into it. You can't do anything with it. And that's not really the way Aristotle's going to think about it.
Yeah. Or maybe another way to put it is for Aristotle, and I think for the Stoics as well, there's no simple decision procedure you can follow for
Mm-hmm.
um, every circumstance. Whereas perhaps for other ethical systems, they'll give you sufficient rules that'll illuminate what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so the last part I wanted to get into then, so that's the golden mean. I think it's a cool idea. It's a different way of thinking about it, and I'll contrast it now with the differences with Stoicism. So the implications and the differences are really clear. First is that for the Stoics, virtue is just knowledge. Pleasure follows from knowledge. It feels good to do the thing you know is right for the Stoics. So there's no need to habituate yourself to enjoy something. In Stoicism, you only need to understand its goodness. Now, we want to be careful when we say habituation because Aristotle means something specific about it. I do think in Stoicism, you want to do things continually. I think in Stoicism, you want to develop habits. But when Aristotle talks about habituation, he means training a non-rational part of yourself the same way your animalistic part of yourself. That picture does not exist in Stoicism. That's not to say Stoics don't have habits or practices or things that they do repeatedly. They also have dispositions, right? You can have a disposition or a habit as a Stoic to question your first impressions of situations. That's something you train and practice and develop, but it's not something. Again, it's not an animalistic response to pleasure or pain that you've cultivated over time through training. Another change with Stoicism is that virtue is not about finding a balance between extremes. It's binary. Virtue is doing the right thing. It's knowing the right thing and then hence doing it. Vice is anything that is wrong. So it's not. It's not about finding your the correct location on a spectrum. It is, I would say, there's going to be either you're allowed to feel that thing or you're not, and either this is the appropriate context to feel it or it isn't. But there's a lot more things that are out of bounds. So revenge, jealousy, grief, anger, envy, all of these things are out of bounds for the Stoics, and they're not going to think about, well, this is a situation that deserves more anger, so it's okay that you got more angry. That to be said, for the Stoics, sometimes virtue is context dependent. So how to act appropriately does depend on your roles and your relationships. So there's a strong contextual feature to living correctly in Stoicism, but sometimes virtue is absolute. So acting ignorantly or being angry is always wrong, for example. So another point I want to call it is that the Stoics exclude certain categories of behavior. Maybe categories isn't the right way to talk about this, but the sage never feels distress at something present, for example. So there is no case as a Stoic whereas we're feeling distressed and extremely upset, passionately upset about something we're experiencing is appropriate. There's no mean. There's no, you've got to grieve the right amount. You've got to be angry the right amount. Because they have this binary axiology, it just doesn't make sense to talk about the appropriate amount of anger. And then the last point I would say is that Aristotle's virtue is more permissive. It allows differing kinds of experiences for the great person who encounters different scenarios. I would say in Stoicism, you only really ever encounter one good thing and one bad thing, virtue and vice. And so the sage emotionally, this is my argument, emotionally sages would be pretty similar. If you had a bunch of Stoic sages hanging out, I think they would be dispositionally pretty similar. Maybe they have, one has more of a sense of humor, one's a bit quieter, but they're responding to the situations they encounter with a similar emotional situation, a similar emotional response. Whereas I think for Aristotle, there might be great people could kind of look different. You could have this great person who's maybe a bit more aggressive and angry and assertive, and you could have a great person who's a bit more, I don't know, maybe intellectual, long-term thinking. I think the Aristotle's picture of great people allows different kinds of great people in a way that maybe Stoicism doesn't. But that's my own thinking. What do you think about those?
Nice. I think that's a solid list. I understand more what you mean by categories now. So I think, yeah, that's a good point. And perhaps one other bit to add to that list is that for the Stoics, virtue is unitary, just as the self is unitary. So you're either virtuous or you're not, whereas Aristotle's happy to say you can be courageous even if you are not exemplifying other virtues. The Stoics, they thought if you're truly being courageous, then all the other virtues must be present as well.
So I actually was doing some reading on this, and apparently there is this view that Aristotle believes in the unitary nature of the virtues, which seems really weird to me. It's something I need to do a bit more reading up on because I read it in a book and I was like, that's silly. Only the Stoics think that. And then it was like, apparently it's, I don't know if it's universally agreed. I'm not an Aristotle expert, but it's like some people think it. It doesn't seem to make much sense to me. It like really ruins my perspective of Aristotle. Because the way I understand Aristotle is the same one you did, Caleb, which is like, yeah, you're courageous because you did the right thing at the right time for the right reason in relation to courage. That doesn't have anything to do with, how you act as in terms of justice, like how you allocate punishments or something. But apparently there's some controversy of that in the academic literature.
Oh no,
Um,
you're probably right. I think what I just said, what I strictly said, is probably wrong in the sense that um, if you're courageous, the other virtues for Aristotle probably do need to be present. You're probably right about that. But maybe he wants to say they're metaphysically distinct in a way the Stoics don't, and maybe that's where there's going to be debates, and
hmm.
perhaps there's some scholarly debate about that as well.
We'll get ready for the follow-up episode. We'll do the unitary nature of the virtues because it doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, we don't need. We're going to end on this like. But as you said, I think we can both agree on the metaphysical distinction, which is that it's like a multi-sided object for the Stoics. Like you can talk about courage, but what you're really talking about is also temperance and justice because you're always just talking about knowledge. Where for Aristotle, even if he believes in the unitary nature of the virtues, it's courage is going to be a different thing than temperance maybe he's got some sort of perspective that it's impossible to be courageous if your lack of temperance is getting in the way. But they're not literally the same thing, because they're not all just knowledge. They're also this habituation and this moral aspect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that was an awesome summary of Aristotle. A great introduction to you're really a deep thinker and philosopher. So thanks for listening. Thanks for putting that together, Michael.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks, Caleb.
Peace.
Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.